Okay, welcome back. So you see I've cleaned up our workspace here. We have just the main body of the mount, and I'm bringing in a few more things we're going to use here. These are Kim Wipe technical wipes from Kimberly-Clark. They're relatively inexpensive. They're very good at cleaning equipment like this. I have a jar of high-grade isopropyl alcohol, which does a pretty good job of cutting through this really nasty grease that's in here. So generally what I like to do, you take the piece, they also make a big size which I'll use, but you just kind of make a ball, get a little squirt of alcohol on it, and it's good for, wiping down all these pieces and getting all your fingerprints off and getting off of your fingers themselves. I also have some gloves we can use when things get really nasty. But for right now, we'll just give it a quick wipe and, just get some of the so there you can see some of this. You can see how dirty that is. It's all just fingerprints and that terrible grease. I'm never going to stop saying terrible things about the grease. Go online and just search Synta grease, S-Y-N-T-A grease. You will see whole web pages probably devoted to hatred of it. Okay, so the next step is going to be separating these major parts. And some of them are easier to do than others. And these require some trickery and some special tools. So the first thing we're going to take off is we're going to take off the saddle part from Declination. Okay, so basically separating the Declination axis, which is this axis right here. You have a normal nut and bolt here, and inside there's actually a second one there. So this axis is only about this long, and it's basically nutted and bolted on both sides. And then this assembly actually here is free and clear. That's where the counterweight goes, but it just threads onto this housing. It doesn't actually go through. Higher quality mounts, the axis goes all the way through and has two bearings, and oftentimes the counterweight actually screws into the axis itself and will spin with the axis. But in this case, it's just right up in here, and that's part of the weakness we're seeing. So what we do here is we go and we pull out our trusty socket collection, and we determine. So this top one is a 16 millimeter, and I know from experience, having gone through there, the bottom one is as well. So these are both 16 millimeter, and that bottom one is very hard to get to. So one of the tools that you're going to want is some sort of wrench to get in there. And I'm going to pause because this wrench is not the right size. I'm going to go get the right one, and I will be right back. Okay, we're back. And I have a 16 millimeter wrench here. And so that will go right in here and catch that nut. And here we have a normal socket. And so what we're going to do is just crank these two apart. So already you can see just too loose. That's what we're seeing there. So finish this up. What do we have in there? We have a washer, we have a nut. So this washer, you have one big stainless one, and then one smaller, this is plastic. This is what they consider a bearing in the world of the CG-4 mount. So now this axis is loose, and so it just slides right out. Okay, so now your declination axis and your saddle are free from your declination housing. So what else do we have in here? Something just made a noise. So here's a spacer. It's sat right here. It'll be a little hard to see when you open up yours. There's a gap right here. There's a spacer. So it turns out that that's this one. So this lock, which was right here, I said there should be a little puck inside. For this case, there's not a puck. There's this larger spacer, so the lock actually presses against this spacer and presses against the axle. Okay, so this is the same as the puck. Now, you can see all that sticky grease. Again, it just sits sideways on my finger like that. All that sticky grease on there. This is so full of grease that I don't even want to put it down without cleaning it a bit first. So get in there and wipe it down a bit just to get most of it off. Otherwise, it'll just make a mess of your workspace. These also have quite a bit of grease on them, but it's not as bad. But where there is a lot of grease is right here. Yeah, that's just what I wiped off, just that little section right there. You can see it's almost like petroleum jelly. I mean, it's you would never think of this to be something that you would want to have spinning, or in any high scientific manner like you do a telescope. This is just, so then here's a spacer that just pops out, okay, and it has a gap, kind of a, let me get it dark there. So you can see the section right here that corresponds with this piece right here. So it sits and it locks itself into place. So that pops up, and of course it too is just absolutely covered in grease. So I have to clean that. We're going to do a better job cleaning all these pieces. This is just so they can go on our workbench without making a mess of things. Here again is more of this thick grease. Okay. So, kind of in order on the shaft is nut, washer, fabric washer. Here's the shaft. On the side is a spacer, and that goes with your lock. And then this goes on, the shaft goes through here. Also on the shaft, in this case, here's a red spacer washer. Okay. That goes there, and we'll take that off. And if you look inside here, there's actually another red washer in there. You can see the color red in there. These two washers actually press against each other, and that's the other bearing surface. So that's considered the bearing surface is these two red fiber washers touching each other. Let's take some of the grease off of here. All sorts of grease in here. And more grease. This is really messy. And this grease is very clean because, like I said, this mount is right out of the factory box. This is brand new. So the grease is still white and pretty easy to work with. If you had one of these, it was 6, 7, 8, 10 years old, that grease would be brown and stiff and very hard to deal with. It ages poorly, it accumulates dirt and humidity, and becomes quite a mess. So one of these brand new ones is not so hard to clean up and deal with, but it can get bad very quickly. So what we actually still have here is there's a nut up here that's holding the saddle together. We have the worm gear assembly here, and in fact you can see inside there's the worm gear, and the worm itself is tied right into the declination axis. Now what's interesting, if I put one of these slow motion controllers on here, let's try this side. So you can turn this worm and it actually slowly turns the axle, but it's super sticky. I mean, it's taken a lot of work to do this. This is with nothing else tied into it. This is just the axle itself. So right off the bat, you know that this is a mess. So let's get the saddle off. So that involves this socket and then some magic way of holding things in place. Again. So let's pause the video while I get this part. Okay, we're back. So let's take that nut off. Now the axle isn't going to spin because the worm gear is holding it in place. So we'll take this nut off. That goes off to the side. So we just have a shaft here. And so now we're going to have to take the worm gear assembly off to free this axle. So the worm gear, there's 4 bolts. There's actually 5. There's a 5th one in there, but there's 2 here and 2 here and a 5th one. So you take those 4 big ones off. And these are used for alignment when we put things back together. Generally, these screws, especially on a newer mount, a younger mount, you know, the machining is pretty good on the threads. Most of these housings are aluminum. Screws are steel. It's very easy to gall them or to strip threads. Generally, they're pretty good. Every now and then, they're not. And sometimes what happens is the powder coating. So once you get the 4 screws out, you can see the 2 long and 2 short ones. This worm gear block basically comes right off. Okay. So now the axle spins freely, and we should be able to pull it. So that comes off there. And now this axle part should come right out. We might leave it there. It might be kind of a permanent part of the saddle. I'll check that out later on. But for right now, we'll leave that on there. So here's our saddle with this declination shaft inside. We'll put that off to the side. Here's the declination worm wheel or gear. This is the part that the worm gear itself rotates against. And so again, let's see just how much grease we can get off of this right now. So all that grease was on that little wheel there. Let's just spend 30 seconds getting some of that off of there. And this mount is turning out to be pretty messy inside, so we're going to go with the big box of wipes. So, not the little box. So I can use those and make nice pads out of them and get some alcohol on them and just get in there and give us a quick wipe. Surprisingly, these worm gears and ring gears are generally pretty well made. The machining on them is actually pretty good. They're done on lathes and they're not that complex of a part once you have the machining done. So they're generally actually pretty good shape. I mean, you can see this has a pretty nice surface to it. It's not all chewed up or anything. It'll run pretty round, and if I put it back on the shaft, for example, it slides down by itself, but it's pretty secure. I mean, there's a little bit of slop in it, but it's not that bad. And it actually spins pretty nicely on there. So what that means is a lot of the other issues come in with these bearing assemblies. It's not actually necessarily these key components. Here's the worm wheel, and if you spin it by hand, you can feel, in this case, it's got a little bit of grittiness to it, but it's not that bad. These two, again, are usually machined pretty well. In almost every case, these are 6mm shafts. That's standard for these. And this worm gear is almost an exact replica of the one that came out in the Super Polaris mount, which was from the 80s. So, you know, this design is pretty common. That was a Japanese mount by Vixen, and it's the one that all of these Chinese Cinta mounts are kind of modeled after. And what they've done is they've taken that same core design, the same kind of core aesthetic design, and expanded on it. And as you go to bigger and more expensive mounts, they're designed better and they're built better, but the same core design is there. So to take these apart, you have a lock nut here, which is, I believe, 17mm. So a 17mm lock nut, and you just hold the assembly with your hand, and it just cracks loose. It's usually not very tight. So you have a little lock nut there. That comes off. Now this part is part where you need a special tool. And so it's a threaded barrel with two little slots cut out. Okay? And to get one of these opened up, you use what's called a spanner wrench or a lens wrench. And for this level, what we're doing is we'll use one like this, okay? And it's got two little flat screw heads here. And they grab the two flats there, and you can use the whole thing to turn this loose. And generally, once it's turned loose just a little bit, you can unscrew it by hand. And so then you have this kind of threaded barrel nut here that comes out. So now you have your worm gear, and it just slides out, and it's got two bearings. The very cheapest mounts don't use bearings. They use like nylon bushings. But once you get to this level and above, they use bearings. But you can see they're very small bearings. And they fit, you know, the machining is very nice on these. Like I said, they're well machined on the lathe. That's generally not the problem. Here's your housing. So there's your Declination gear assembly taken apart. Okay, you got your worm wheel, your worm gear, the bearings, the locking assembly. These are the screws that hold the frame together. This is the bearing plate. So that all goes together. So the step now is take all those pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and put them off to the side in your storage bin together so you can keep track of them. And here you can take your saddle and put it off to the side. We'll take this and we'll clean it up and wipe it all down. And we'll probably polish this axle just a little bit, but we'll put that off to the side for now. As well, here's the rest of the Declination bearing assembly. Let's put that up here for right now. We'll see what we're going to do next. So, one thing that can be done right off the bat, since we've just experienced it on the other half, is we can take the right ascension worm gear off. It's the exact same design. That's the other kind of key of this Vixen-derived Cinta models, is that often the two axes, the core parts, like these frames and the worm gears and all that, are matched. Makes for less machining costs, easier design. That's used even now in some very expensive mounts. I've been working on iOptron mounts, and they use the same technique. The two worm gear assemblies for right ascension and declination are exactly the same. And so they only have to design one mount and use it in both cases. So again, take these screws out, the big long ones and the short ones. Here's another tool that you might find useful. Is some sort of tweezers. I actually have several different ones for what I'm doing, but you're always going to be reaching in and grabbing little screws that are loose in places. So here, this assembly comes off, and again, we have the right ascension worm gear, and we'll take that apart the same way. As you can see, it's basically all the same parts, so it's kind of 17mm lock nut. Crack that loose. Take our spanner wrench, loosen the locking bushing there. That comes off. Our gear comes out. So in this case, the second bearing stayed in place, and there's a bit of a spacer there. Okay. So if that's the problem, then you can take your, just about anything, just carefully pop that bearing out. It should come out pretty quickly. So this side has a spacer on it. The other side actually here's the declination one that we took off earlier. It actually does have spacers. So when I pull the bearings away, I can you can see that there's actually spacers on both sides. They didn't come off because this one was a little bit stickier. So right ascension is going to be the same way. If I take the bearing away, there's a spacer on that side, there's a spacer on that side. So be aware there's a spacer on each one. They look like they're probably the exact same size, but just be aware. What this does is it allows them to use the same worm gear in multiple mounts, depending on the size of this housing. So right ascension assembly, screws, lock nuts, housing, again, off into our storage bin. So now we can see here, this is the right ascension worm gear. This is much, much larger. This is bigger in diameter than the other one. If I bring the other one over, you can see the comparison. They're much different. The right ascension worm gear is bigger for two main reasons. One is it holds the entire declination assembly and the saddle and the telescope, so it's got to be a bit beefier. But the declination one only holds the saddle and the telescope. And two, this gear is the one that's driving all the time to track the sky, and so it's larger, so you can get a slower speed out of it with the same worm gear. When that worm spins once, this only goes around a fraction of the time that the declination does in the same worm gear speed. So this allows it to go a little bit slower. It's easier to deal with when you're tracking the mount, tracking the sky. Some telescopes, the two gears are symmetric, and so the speed that the motors run is the same. But in this case, it's not. So this is a much larger gear in here that we have to be aware of when we're taking the assembly apart. And again, this one is going to have lots and lots and lots of grease on it. So while we're here, there's a nice cover plate. And what a lot of people don't realize is it comes from the factory with a little plastic sheet over it. If you take that sheet off, just like your electronics, now you have a nice shiny cover plate that looks better. So don't forget to take that sheet off. There's a couple of them in other places as well. In fact, here, if I bring back the, this is the polar scope mount. This piece has the same kind of sheet of plastic on it that can come off. It's just to protect the surface, to keep it shiny and clean while it's in storage, but there's no reason to leave it there. I actually see quite a few of these with that sheet still on them, because people are unaware that you can take that little piece of plastic off. That's just for protection. So there you go. Now it looks shinier now. Now we're happy. So let's see. The trick for this This piece right here is actually a giant nut that screws onto the right ascension axis and holds the whole thing together. And this uses a special tool as well. This is a different kind of spanner nut. You could use one of these. They have pointed ends and they separate out, and you can point them down into those holes and turn them. But these are not really that strong for that assembly. There's a different kind of spanner wrench that's better for these. And that's this one. So this one separates out. It's got two fingers there, and these are replaceable with different sizes. And they go into these holes, and the whole thing can be used to wrench it open. So these tips are different sizes. What's on there right now is 2mm, and they're too big for these holes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time figuring out what size these holes are, and I'll get my thing ready, and we'll come back for the next video.